Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now, it has been a while since I've had an opportunity to sit down and paint, so this one is going to be a little longer than usual. You'll notice as well that the standard I've gone for here is probably a little bit higher than I do ordinarily, and part of that is just because it's about time, I think, we did something a little bit more, if not advanced, then a bit more time consuming, a little more care taken with what we're painting. I have done speed painting for British troops before, so going a little bit further and instead doing, a nice version, I thought that would be interesting for a change of pace. As well, with the new Warlord plastic figures, I thought, well, it's time to show them off. And I'm really pleased with the result. I think these are a brilliant kit. I'm really excited to finally have this flash new set of British plastics, especially with D-Day just coming around the corner. So, as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Now, there are a few mixes in this one, so when those come up, they will be mentioned on screen. So make sure you're paying attention to when those do come along. But all of the actual paints you'll need, like I said, will be listed. So without any further mucking around, let's get started. Now to begin with, I've primed this fella with a spray of Vallejo's English uniform. And honestly, if you've got a whole bunch of British infantry that you're going to paint, it's kind of a no-brainer. You can spray that directly onto grey plastic, it doesn't need another primer underneath, and it's the right colour. What more do you need? Now speaking of right colour, I have previously shown you some ways of painting British infantry which used flat earth, or even US field drab, but today I'm actually going to use English uniform. But out of one of these little bottles, and I'll explain why. Now these are the same colour, both in dropper bottles, so why bother swapping them? Reason being is that you will find the green content in English uniform will slowly rise to the top, and you'll get a little bit more green finish from this stuff than is actually accurate. It'll change as you go through more of the bottle. So the bottom of the bottle is going to be almost brown, whereas your early stuff is going to look quite green and almost sickly by comparison. Now you can drop a couple of agitators into one of these Vallejo pots, but I've tended to find there isn't quite enough room in there to really shake it up, at least by hand, and get that accurate uniform colour. So what I do is I've just transferred it into one of these little pots that I've got off of Amazon, a few cents for each of them. You get big bags of 50, and I use these a lot. Dropped in a couple of agitators and a wee bit of mixing medium, just to thin it out, and I've now got English uniform, which I can shake very vigorously, and that will always give me that more accurate, slightly brownish colour. Now, even though we've sprayed our fella with English uniform, and I'm getting a little tired of saying those two words back to back, if we do need to cover that up later, we make a mistake, the stuff from the pot is not going to have quite the same finish as the spray. So what we're going to do is just start off by applying a thin coat of English uniform over the English uniform. This doesn't need to be particularly careful, as you can see. We are just jamming this straight onto the whole miniature and then give it about 5 or 10 minutes to dry. Now, as you can see, that's nice and simple. What we're going to move on to now is painting the skin. And there isn't really a right way of doing this. It's down to how you like to paint skin. I'm going to use the Army Painter's tanned flesh to start with, though. So this will go on quite nicely, but you will find in some areas you're going to need to come back and give it a second coat. Just make sure you let this one dry for about 5 minutes before you try applying a second. Otherwise, it's going to go a little bit bonk. I've added just a wee bit of water to make this flow properly. And you'll see it is a little bit patchy first going on, but we're going to solve that with that second coat. So let's come back a couple of minutes. Now once his skin's painted, it's time to move on to his webbing and equipment. And the wonderful thing about the British uniform is that for most of the war, it didn't actually change very much. Certainly the battle dress was the same colour the whole way through. The only thing that would really change significantly was helmet covers and, well, his webbing colour. Now for this late war period that we're doing, this would have been green. And for this, I'm actually using another Army painter color. This is Army Green. Now I have used Russian green, a Russian uniform green from Vallejo for this previously, which does cover a little better, but it is a bit more washed out and dark, versus with army green here, you get just enough color that once we shade it, it's still going to have a little bit of character to it. Now this respirator bag on the side here, this would also have been in green, and don't forget the strap across his chest. So this one here, let's just get in. Careful, careful. And don't worry too much if you do hit, his sleeve or something, because of course we can go back to our English uniform later and tidy that up. You'll probably find with army green, you'll need to come back and give some areas a second coat just to strengthen the color. But everywhere that's going to be green, so his gaiters down here, the straps here on his water bottle, make sure that you're not missing those either. I find it easiest just to paint quite messily here, and we'll tidy up the water bottle later. And here's entrenching tool cover as well. Now once that's had a chance to dry, you'll see that it isn't as madly green as it looks coming out of the pot. It's actually quite a nice military sort of green. Army green, why not? Now I have made a couple of little mistakes on his collar, which I'm going to go fix up later, but I always recommend leave your cleanup stages near the last, because you'll save yourself a lot of time. What I've got now, this is camo olive green, and I've got a little bit of a raggedy older brush here, because there's so much surface detail on the helmets that have scrim knitting anyway, that I don't want to spend forever painting into each of these little areas. So what I'm going to do is just lay down most of the color first with a few quick jabs of this brush, and then I will swap down to a smaller one to paint around the rim and up closer to his face. Now while that's drying, you can move on to any wooden details. And for this I'm using beige brown. A little bit of water in there as usual, and so for example his rifle, don't worry about areas that are going to be black later, just cover over the whole thing. As well, you'll have his entrenching tool, the handle on that. This would ordinarily be brown, so a little bit of this just carefully in there. Now I am going to paint, I'm going for accuracy here, so I'm going to use flat earth a little later on for the water bottle. But if you wanted to save some time and a paint, you could just paint this in brown here too. It's up to you. So let's go ahead and get that flat earth, and we'll just dab in the water bottle now. Now we're going to move on to the netting on his helmet. And for this I've got khaki, and you'll notice I'm scrubbing most of it off onto a bit of kitchen towel here. Reason being, I'm going to very lightly dry brush the top of his helmet with this to leave the green in the recesses, and we'll just pick out the netting in khaki. Very, very simple to do. Now at this stage you could stick with khaki, but I'd suggest you probably want to go to German camo beige for this. And we're going to paint in the strap across his helmet. Once I find it, there we go. And we'll also do the strap for his rifle. And as always, this is easier without a camera in the way, so you'll still probably find as with most of these lighter colors, you will need to come back and give it a second coat. Now as we come at last to black, we're starting to reach the home stretch. Now there's a few black details on these guys, which most importantly is going to be his boots, but also parts of his rifle. And as well, spin this fella around, he's got the bayonet sheath on the back of his respirator bag. And if you have any issues with these, you're not sure what bits should be black, I thoroughly recommend you can either ask Google, jokes aside, typing in, World War II, British webbing, and then something like Osprey, and go to the Images tab. You're going to find a wealth of information there, or just follow along with what's on the box. And when it comes to doing his rifle, remember any mistakes you make, we can touch back up later with some fresh brown paint. Now there is here one last detail without which I think the whole operation would likely have foundered and never gotten off the beaches, and that is the teacup. Now, honestly, by this stage, I believe they were being enameled in brown, but I think you'd find plenty of them still in white with that distinctive blue stripe. And honestly, I mean, if you can't rule of cool a teacup, then you might have gone too far. But I've got here Vallejo off-white, and I'm just going to give this a couple of quick coats for his mug. Now, once that white is dry, you can go ahead and do your cleanup stage. So I've gone ahead, touched up his battle dress, parts of his skin that I had made little mistakes on. It's now ready for its shade. I want to show you this. Now this is exactly what it says on the bottle. This is a 1-to-1 mix of Quick Shade Mixing Medium, the stuff listed at the bottom, and Army Painter Strong Tone. It is magic, but the reason why it's in a clear bottle is to show you this junk. All this collected gumph at the bottom, right? If it's sitting there, it's not in your mix doing what it should be doing. So anytime someone asks a question of, why is my shade not working? Why is it drying shiny? Anything like that, it's this gumph here. All right, these are an acrylic product, you got to shake them. So I'm going to give this a good shake, and then we're going to apply it generously over the whole miniature. And look, no junk on the bottom, all mixed in, ready to do what it's got to do. So let's go ahead and get a couple of dots of this. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, why not? On your palette. And then with a big softish brush, start working this all over the miniature. Now you don't want it to collect, if I leave a big dollop on a sleeve there, that's not ideal. What I want is to move that around and guide it into any recesses. So up on his face, under his arm, wherever. And what I'm going to do is cover the entire miniature in this stuff and then give it about 20 to 30 minutes to dry. It's a nice sunny day for a change, so it might not take very long, but better to leave it a little bit longer just to be on the safe side. Now, once that's dried, you'll have something that looks like this. And it's not quite as shiny as it appears on the camera, but there is a little bit of a sheen, and I'm not worried about that because that's what we have matte varnish for. What I'm going to do now, though, is actually go back to English uniform, because I want this fella to be, part of quite a nice looking army. So we're going to spend a little bit more time in this fella on usual. This is optional, but what I'm going to do is just pick some of the areas where more of this shade has collected than I might like. So on the top of his sleeve here, for example, I'm just going to get in there and brighten that up a little. This is a good candidate. Let's just brighten this up some. And you don't need to go crazy with this. Just areas where you want that original color, go back with your English uniform. Now, if you're painting for the tabletop, this is one where it's kind of up to you whether or not this is necessary. Personally, I like ordinarily quite a large amount of contrast. So deep, deep shades and really sharp highlights. It looks good on the table. But I want these guys to photograph nicely too. So I am going to cover over some of those higher points again and brighten them up. Now I've left the shading intact, but you'll see that the flatter areas have that original color back to them, which is going to work quite well for a very smooth transition of color, which is what I've got here. Now, it's important, always keep track of the mixes you're using if you're going to mix your highlights. Otherwise, when you come back to paint these guys later, you're going to have a problem. But English uniform, with about 3 parts English uniform to 1 part Iraqi sand, is what I've got for my English uniform highlights. So let's pour some of this out, and then we can start applying this to the extreme edges of some of the areas of his uniform, like his sleeve, on his collar here, a little bit careful there, along the tops of his sleeves if you want those to be a bit brighter, and anywhere that you want a really sharp crease. So let's do some of his trousers too. Now you'll notice that that goes on quite sharp and bright, but as it dries, it tones down a little bit. So if you really want, and I mean, I'm just wasting time at this point and having fun, but if you want to do something crazy for your commanders, you really want to spend the time on them, you can finish off by going to straight Iraqi sand And just doing some tiny, tiny little highlights at extreme edges. Now, past a point, those will look quite sharp and maybe a little unrealistic. But again, this is something that when we matte varnish them, those will tone down and blend in quite nicely. Not something, like I mentioned, that I would ordinarily do on my basic infantry, but it pays to know if you do want to go that far. I've got now some barbarian flesh, and I'm going to do the same thing, highlight his face, and his hands as well. So nice and simple, just following the contours of his skin and leaving that darker color in the recesses. I might swap to a smaller brush for this. Yes, I will definitely swap to a small brush. Now I've covered over most of his face with barbarian flesh, and it didn't turn out quite as I planned. I made a little bit of a mistake here or there, but I'm not too worried. We'll fix that up in a moment. I'm going to move on to the final highlight for his skin, which is corpse pale. And this, my goodness, is really bright going on. So just a little bit of this to the very tip of his nose, the backs of his knuckles. Let's just do his chin and tips of fingers. Ooh, very carefully. There we go. Blacking in the area with his teeth and then painting some of that off-white in there. That did the job. That looks like a much better face. What we'll do now is move on to his webbing. Now I'm not going to do the 3-stage highlight with this, although you certainly could if you wanted to. What we're going to do is just use this to pick out some of the very edges of his webbing in much the same way as his clothing. So you can be pretty sparing with this if you want, or you can use it to really brighten him up. So getting a look at the side of his pack here, let's just use the side of our brush to draw attention to the edge of the pack. Same too down here with his respirator bag, and anywhere else you want a nice sharp highlight on this green. Now he's really starting to come together. That shine on the miniature is still a little difficult to work against, but like I said, matte varnish is going to sort us out. Now a really easy highlight for anything, especially World War II stuff that you might want to look a little faded, is to put just a tiny dot of ivory into the base color. So for example, that German camo beige we did earlier was just a wee little smidgen of ivory in there. I've got a brilliant highlight color for all of those areas. So let's just brighten those up a bit. Now speaking of ivory, we're going to go back to off-white and we will tidy up the mug. This isn't a particularly taxing stage, luckily, so let's just cover that over. When you come near the rim, leave just a little bit of that shaded area near the top. And then at this scale, any sort of light blue will do the job. I'm using here electric blue from the Army Painter, and we're just going to paint in that little rim. Now finally, I've actually got a color. This is from the Vallejo Air range, but whether it comes out of an airbrush or off a brush itself, it's going to give you the same color. This is gunmetal, and this is going to just go over, well, just highlight the gunmetal with it. And there we have it at last. Our British soldier is complete. Now I haven't painted anything in about a month, so I've really enjoyed just having the opportunity to do something which I was going to enjoy for the sake of it. I probably wouldn't go this far with ordinary soldiers in a normal army, particularly if you have seen my video on speed painting British airborne. You can probably tell the point at which I would just turn around, whip out the Iraqi sand and dry brush the whole miniature. So all of the soft parts, give those a dry brush rather than doing the painstaking highlighting we did later. But I think this finished product, I'm really pleased with that. I'd be quite happy to put that on the table. I should point out, if you were going to go ahead and put his decals on, whoops, I should have done that before applying the varnish. But, you guys can do that when you paint your own. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the patrons who are keeping me ticking over in paint and glue, including producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Connor, and Fred. Your support really is invaluable. So any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comments box below. My Twitter and Facebook are both linked there too. Thank you very much for your time, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.